The morning fog clung to the battered fields of Normandy like a living thing, drifting between the burnt skeletons of farmhouses and the twisted remains of armored beasts that had fought here the night before. The world was quiet in that peculiar way battlefields often are at dawn, too calm, too still, too final. But beneath that silence, something stirred. A low rumble, a vibration in the mud. Then another, and another. Through the mist, one shape emerged, then 5, then 20. M4, Sherman tanks, dented, scarred, some with makeshift armor welded onto their hulls, others streaked with soot, pushed forward in a slow but relentless tide. Their engines coughed and growled, their tracks grinding down the soft French soil. They looked almost humble compared to the hulking silhouettes of the German Panzers that had once ruled this terrain. The Shermans were modest machines, tall-profiled, lightly armored, their 75mm guns not much comfort against the Panthers and Tigers waiting somewhere beyond the haze. Yet they came. Always more of them came. A German tanker, Obergefreiter Karl Welz, had once laughed at the sight of a captured Sherman. "This," he said, tapping its armor plate nonchalantly, "a tractor with a cannon. It burns if you look at it wrong." The men around him had chuckled. Their Panthers were sleeker, their Tigers more terrifying. German armor was the apex predator of the battlefield. The Sherman was prey, but that had been earlier in the war. Now, as Karl stood beside the smoking wreck of his own Panther, its engine seized, fuel exhausted, spare parts non-existent, he felt a new sensation rising in his chest. Not amusement, not scorn, something colder. The Shermans kept coming out of the fog, 20, 30, maybe more. Even damaged, they looked alive, crawling across the landscape like a steel tide. Behind each machine was a crew who had survived another day, not because their tank was superior, but because they could be repaired overnight, resupplied by afternoon, and replaced entirely by the end of the week. Karl's thoughts drifted back to the stories German high command had pushed early in the war. Stories of technological superiority and the myth of the invincible Panzer. But those legends meant nothing now. Not when the Allied armored divisions had begun operating like an industrial rhythm, a heartbeat powered by American factories an ocean away. Every time a German crew knocked out a Sherman, 3 more seemed to appear on the horizon. Sherman Commander Jack Harkins, riding in one of the approaching tanks, felt a similar complexity in his chest. Fear, yes, always fear. The Sherman's armor could fail catastrophically from a single, well-placed German shell. But this morning, rolling forward with dozens of others, Jack felt something else too. Momentum, confidence, purpose. He wasn't alone out here. He never really was. The strength of the Sherman wasn't in any one tank. It was in the column, the battalion, the endless supply line that fed them all. As the fog lifted and sunlight glinted off dozens of shifting turret rings, the battlefield of Normandy revealed a truth that both sides had felt but never spoken. The war would not be decided by the strongest tank. It would be decided by the tank that showed up again, and again, and again. And in 1944, nothing showed up like the Sherman. Before the Sherman became the symbol of Allied armored strength, before German crews mocked it on sight, its story began in the uneasy months before America entered the Second World War. The U.S. Army did not yet imagine duels with Tigers or Panthers. It imagined mobility, reliability, a tank that could be built fast, repaired easily, shipped across oceans, and maintained by crews who might have stepped off a farm tractor only months earlier. The Sherman wasn't born from a desire to dominate. It was born from a need to endure. In early 1941, American designers at the Aberdeen Proving Ground worked under enormous pressure. The fall of France had stunned the world. Britain fought alone, and its survival, should the United States decide to join the war, might depend on American production. The Army needed a medium tank that balanced firepower, armor, speed, and range, but crucially, it had to be manufacturable at scale. Not 5 tanks a month, not 50, but hundreds, eventually thousands. The result was the M4 Sherman, a tank that embodied compromise in almost every dimension. It carried a 75mm gun adequate for infantry support and for fighting early war German armor. Its welded or cast hull provided moderate protection. Its high-set profile gave crews more internal space and made the tank easier to service. Its gasoline engine, controversial at first, could be built quickly and maintained by mechanics familiar with American automotive design. Nothing about the Sherman was extreme, and that was exactly the point. On paper, it wasn't a tank meant to intimidate the hardened veterans of the German Panzerwaffe, and early German opinions reflected that. When German crews first encountered the Sherman in North Africa in late 1942, many were unimpressed. Compared to the Panzer IV, the Sherman's armor was serviceable but hardly exceptional. Its 75mm gun struggled to penetrate heavier German tanks from the front at long range. Its tall silhouette made it easier to spot on open terrain. Some German tankers, upon capturing a Sherman, joked that it felt like a bus with a cannon. Others noted its tendency to catch fire when ammunition ignited, a flaw the Allies later addressed with wet ammunition racks. But the Germans overlooked something that would eventually reshape their entire experience of the war. The Sherman was reliable, remarkably so. In desert heat, in the mud of Italy, in the hedgerows of Normandy, Shermans often required far less maintenance than German vehicles. A Panther or Tiger might spend days in a repair yard waiting for specialized parts. A Sherman could be patched on the field, restarted, and sent back into action by nightfall. This difference was not a footnote. It was the beginning of a strategic revolution. And then there was the matter of production. While Germany struggled to balance resource shortages, Allied bombing, and increasingly complex tank designs, American factories were doing something unprecedented. They were building tanks like automobiles. Assembly line production meant that by 1943 and 1944, Shermans rolled out of factories in streams so steady they seemed limitless. Crewmen joked that the tank came in flavors: diesel engines, radial engines, welded hulls, cast hulls, whatever the factory could produce fastest. Uniformity took a back seat to quantity, and quantity was a battlefield weapon. German intelligence reported, almost in disbelief, that American production numbers dwarfed German output many times over. Where Germany might field a company of Panthers, the Allies could deploy battalions of Shermans. Where Germany lost a tank and replaced it slowly, the Allies replaced theirs rapidly. The industrial scales of war were tipping, and the Sherman was the weight on the lever. Yet the human element mattered just as much. Sherman crews were often citizens turned soldiers, mechanics, farmers, students, training on a tank intentionally designed to be intuitive. The controls were simple, the engine accessible, the handling forgiving. A crew could become proficient quickly, and more importantly, stay in the fight. The Germans, for all their engineering mastery, had not prepared for a war against a nation that could produce good enough weapons in overwhelming numbers. Their mockery of the Sherman was not entirely misplaced. Its flaws were real, but their underestimation of what mass production meant in modern war would become one of the most consequential misjudgments of the conflict. The Sherman wasn't designed to outmatch the enemy tank for tank. It was designed to outlast them. And that design philosophy, humble, almost unglamorous, would become one of the most decisive factors in the armored war on the Western Front. The story of the Sherman's rise and the German tankers' shifting perception of it unfolded across several pivotal years of the war. Each stage of the conflict reshaped what the Sherman meant on the battlefield. First, a competent but unremarkable newcomer, then an outmatched underdog, and finally, a symbol of relentless Allied momentum. Its evolution mirrored the war itself. When the M4 Sherman first entered combat during the North African campaign, it represented a leap forward for the Allies. American crews were still green, but the Sherman arrived at a moment when British forces were desperate for a dependable medium tank that could stand up to German Panzer IIIs and early Panzer IVs. In this environment, the Sherman performed well, sometimes impressively. At El Alamein and later in Operation Torch, the Sherman's 75mm gun proved capable against the majority of German armor encountered. Its stabilized gun, though primitive by later standards, allowed crews to fire more effectively on the move than many Axis tanks. Its mechanical reliability also shocked some British commanders accustomed to coaxing temperamental crusaders and grants through harsh desert conditions. German crews took note. They respected the Sherman more than they admitted aloud. It was sturdy, it shot straight, and unlike many pre-war Allied designs, it didn't break down every 20 miles. Still, when facing the newer, long-barreled Panzer IV variants or the infamous Tiger one, the Sherman was clearly outclassed. This gap in capability would define the mid-war years. As the Allies pushed into Sicily and mainland Italy, the Sherman remained the backbone of their armored forces. But the German response evolved too. More Tigers appeared, and with them came Panther prototypes destined for future battles. Sherman crews began to understand the limits of their tank. At long range, especially in mountainous terrain that favored defenders, German guns could knock out Shermans before the Allied tanks closed enough to return effective fire. Still, the M4's reliability and speed proved valuable in the fluid, grinding battles of Italy, where maneuver and support mattered more than tank duels. For German tankers, the Sherman remained a nuisance rather than a direct threat. But a new worry was growing: the increasing number of Shermans arriving in theater. Each destroyed tank seemed replaced within days. Each battalion appeared reinforced faster than German units could manage. The war of attrition was beginning quietly. Backstage, Normandy transformed the Sherman's reputation for both sides. When the Allies landed in June 1944, the German Panther had become widespread. Its powerful 75mm high-velocity gun and sharply angled armor shocked Sherman crews, many of whom found that their own shells simply bounced off a Panther's frontal plate. The Tiger 110, though less common, remained a deadly presence. Against these opponents, the Sherman seemed painfully outdated. This was when German mockery peaked. To them, the Sherman looked like a tall, clumsy machine doomed the moment it was spotted. Stories circulated of Panthers taking out multiple Shermans in single engagements. German propaganda celebrated these successes, reinforcing the myth of invulnerable Panzers. But unseen behind the battlefield statistics was a deeper shift, one that would soon redefine the conflict. By late June and July 1944, Allied production capacity was fully felt on the Western Front. Sherman tanks poured ashore in Normandy at rates German commanders found impossible to comprehend. A Panther destroyed in combat might be gone forever. A Sherman destroyed could often be replaced within 48 to 72 hours. Maintenance magnified this advantage. German crews routinely spent days repairing engines, transmissions, and suspensions, particularly in Panthers, whose mechanical issues were notorious. Meanwhile, Sherman crews benefited from standardized parts, simpler construction, and entire support battalions dedicated solely to keeping them running. The more the German tankers fought the Sherman, the more they realized they weren't fighting a tank. They were fighting an industrial system. One Panther might defeat several Shermans in a head-on duel, yes, but the Panthers were aging, breaking, running out of fuel, or simply being abandoned when they could not be repaired. Shermans, meanwhile, kept rolling forward in battalion strength. By September 1944, Germany's armored forces were struggling. Fuel shortages crippled their mobility. Spare parts became rare. Production lagged far behind losses. Shermans weren't just dominating by numbers, they were now being upgraded. The arrival of the M4A3, fitted with a more powerful Ford GAA engine, gave American units better torque and reliability. Even more decisive was the 76mm gun variant, designed specifically to counter heavier German armor. Though still not equal to a Panther in a frontal duel, the 76mm Sherman could penetrate German tanks from the sides and at closer ranges, exactly where Allied doctrine encouraged engagement. The myth of Sherman inferiority began to crack. By the final months of the war, the sheer volume of Allied armor had become overwhelming. Hundreds of Shermans crossed into Germany, supporting infantry, smashing strong points, and occupying territory faster than German troops could react. German tankers, once amused by the Sherman, now faced a nightmare scenario. They were fighting a machine that simply kept returning. If a Sherman was knocked out, another took its place. If a Panther was knocked out, it was a devastating loss, and that imbalance became the story of the war. The true turning points in the Sherman story were not single battles, nor individual duels between Allied and German armor. They were moments, sometimes subtle, sometimes shattering, when perceptions shifted on both sides of the front. On these days, German tankers began realizing that technical superiority alone could not win the war, and Allied crews learned that their own survival depended on something far larger than the armor wrapped around them. One such turning point came in the weeks after the initial Normandy landings. At first, German crews fought with confidence. Panther battalions moved into position, exploiting long-range firepower, confident in their sloped armor and deadly high-velocity guns. Sherman shells bounced harmlessly from the thick frontal plates, and German gunners, trained through years of increasingly desperate combat, found their targets quickly. Yet, as the battles intensified, something unexpected emerged. For every Sherman destroyed, two more seemed to appear. Newly arrived American divisions rolled into the hedgerow country with fresh tanks, fresh engines, and full tanks of fuel. German crews often fought with machines that were already months or years old, machines that had survived Russia, Italy, or France once before. Their vehicles were battle-worn, temperamental, and nearly impossible to replace. Supply convoys attacked from the air meant that fuel shortages were constant. Panthers were sometimes abandoned without ever firing a shot. The mismatch revealed itself most clearly during Operation Cobra in July 1944, when the U.S. First Army finally cracked the German defensive lines. The breakthrough wasn't achieved because Sherman crews suddenly had a technological edge. It happened because the Allied armies could concentrate overwhelming numbers of tanks, self-propelled guns, transport vehicles, fuel trucks, and repair units at the right place and the right time. It was industrial warfare in its purest form, a kind of momentum Germany could not match. Another major turning point emerged as German tankers encountered the revised Sherman variants. Rumors began spreading along German armored units that some Shermans now carried a higher velocity gun. The arrival of the 76mm variant didn't make the Sherman superior to a Panther in a direct frontal engagement, but it changed the psychological terrain of tank combat. Suddenly, German commanders had to assume that any approaching Sherman could be a legitimate threat, capable of penetrating their armor from the sides or at medium range. This uncertainty chipped away at the earlier German overconfidence. As one Panther commander later recalled, "We no longer knew which Sherman we were facing. The duel became unpredictable." The battlefield advantage of technological superiority was eroding. You could no longer count on a single, well-placed shot to stop a U.S. armored advance. At the same time, Sherman crews were experiencing their own turning point. After the trauma of Normandy's hedgerow fighting, many tankers felt exposed and undergunned. They knew German tanks could kill them at distances where they themselves couldn't reply effectively. But gradually, through bitter experience, Allied crews learned to fight according to doctrine. Flank the enemy, call in artillery or air support, overwhelm with numbers, maintain pressure, and above all else, keep moving. The Sherman was not designed to duel Panthers and Tigers head-on, and once crews accepted this, their effectiveness grew dramatically. Normandy transformed the Sherman's reputation for both sides. When the Allies landed in June 1944, the German Panther had become widespread. Its powerful 75mm high-velocity gun and sharply angled armor shocked Sherman crews, many of whom found that their own shells simply bounced off a Panther's frontal plate. The Tiger whine, though less common, remained a deadly presence. Against these opponents, the Sherman seemed painfully outdated. This was when German mockery peaked. To them, the Sherman looked like a tall, clumsy machine doomed the moment it was spotted. Stories circulated of Panthers taking out multiple Shermans in single engagements. German propaganda celebrated these successes, reinforcing the myth of invulnerable Panzers. But unseen behind the battlefield statistics was a deeper shift, one that would soon redefine the conflict. The psychological transformation was profound. Instead of seeing themselves as doomed underdogs, Sherman crews began understanding the advantage they truly possessed. They had radios that worked consistently. They had mechanics working around the clock. They had fuel, ammunition, replacements, and medical support. And above all, they had quantity, an armored presence so large that even significant losses did not halt an offensive. The Germans, exhausted and increasingly isolated, could feel this change as well. Reports from panzer divisions retreating through France frequently mentioned being chased by endless Shermans, or fighting off one American armored column only to find another arriving within hours. German intelligence officers began warning high command that they were losing the war of numbers. In private conversations, some tankers admitted a new and unfamiliar fear, not fear of the Sherman's gun or armor, but fear of its persistence. The final turning point came in late 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, German forces launched one last offensive, hoping to shatter Allied cohesion. For a moment, they succeeded in surprising the Americans. Panthers and Tigers broke through thin defensive lines, and Sherman units were pushed back. But as the offensive continued, the German flaw became unmistakable. Rare was the tank battalion that could remain fueled, repaired, and supplied long enough to exploit its early gains. Meanwhile, the Allies rushed Shermans to the front faster than German reconnaissance could track them. Even in winter storms, even in terrain thought impassable, the tide of Shermans thickened. Germany's final gamble collapsed under the weight of American logistics. This was the moment many German tankers later recalled as the true shift. Not a duel, not a knockout blow, just the realization spreading like cold water down the spine that no matter how many Shermans they destroyed, the stream would never stop. And once that realization set in, the outcome of the armored war was sealed. War is often spoken of in terms of divisions, fronts, and strategies. But inside a tank, the world becomes painfully small. 5 men in a steel box, each with a job that could mean life or death for the others. The story of the Sherman and its overwhelming presence on the battlefield is incomplete without the voices of those who lived, fought, and sometimes died inside them. One of the earliest and most revealing human stories comes from Sergeant William Bill McLaughlin, a gunner with the U.S. 2nd Armored Division in Normandy. He described his first encounter with a panther in the hedgerows as like throwing rocks at a barn door. His 75mm rounds struck the German tank and simply bounced off. The Panthers' return fire came with brutal speed. One shell tore through the hedge and slammed into the Sherman next to his. Bill remembered the sound, not the explosion, not the fire, but the sudden silence inside the neighboring tank. It was as if the men had vanished, he said later. 1 second, voices, the next nothing. Stories like this formed the emotional landscape of Sherman crews. They knew their tank was not the strongest. They knew that a panther could kill them before they even saw it. But they also knew something else. They didn't face these machines alone. Every tank had another beside it. Every platoon had a company behind it. And on the roads leading back to the beaches, more Shermans rolled off landing craft every hour. The hedgerow fighting in Normandy produced countless stories of terror and resilience. The Germans, well dug in and equipped with experienced panzer crews, used the terrain masterfully. In thick bocage country, armored vehicles could not see beyond a few meters. This nullified long-range gunnery advantages and forced tanks into close-range ambushes, where even a small German anti-tank team could wreak havoc. Sherman driver Harold Emerson recalled inching forward through a narrow gap one morning, heart pounding so hard that it felt like it would shake the tank. You didn't know if a tiger was waiting behind that hedgerow or a kid with a Panzerfaust, he said. Either one could kill you. Yet with the terror came a strange, almost defiant calm. If they killed mine, Harold continued, another Sherman would take my place, and if they killed that one, another would follow. This sense of continuity became a psychological anchor for Sherman crews. They were not expected to win duels. They were expected to keep pushing, and they did, through the hedgerows, through the towns, through the endless mud and smoke. On the German side, human stories painted a different picture. One of experienced tankers gradually worn down by logistics, fatigue, and the realization that they were becoming outnumbered far beyond anything they had imagined. Hans Behrens, a Panther loader in the 12th SS Panzer Division, later described his shock during the fighting around St. Lo. His crew knocked out 3 Shermans in under 10 minutes. They felt victorious for a moment. Then, emerging from the smoke down the road, came an entire column of new Shermans, engines roaring, turrets turning in unison. Hans recalled his commander muttering, "Es hört nie auf. It never stops." For the first time, Hans said, he realized that they weren't fighting a tank. They were fighting a system that manufactured tanks faster than they could be destroyed. As the Allies pushed inland, the Battle of Falaise provided some of the most dramatic examples of Sherman's overwhelming German armor. By mid-August, German units trapped in the shrinking pocket were desperately trying to escape encirclement. Their tanks were low on fuel, ammunition, and mobility. Shermans surrounded them on the ridges and crossroads. One German crew reported abandoning a Panther simply because it couldn't start. Another Panther burned after its engine caught fire while reversing. The sheer volume of Sherman activity during this period left a deep psychological scar. German tankers, trained to perfection in mechanical and gunnery skills, found themselves outmaneuvered not by tactics but by exhaustion and numbers. Sherman crews, too, bore scars. Corporal James "Jimmy" Lawson recalled stopping near the town of Trun to retrieve wounded infantry. His tank had taken 2 glancing hits earlier that day, and the interior still smelled of scorched paint. He opened the hatch to the cool evening air and heard something unexpected: laughter. 2 infantrymen were sitting beside a knocked-out Sherman, joking about how many times their own tank had been hit. Normandy transformed the Sherman's reputation for both sides. When the Allies landed in June 1944, the German Panther had become widespread. Its powerful 75mm high-velocity gun and sharply angled armor shocked Sherman crews, many of whom found that their own shells simply bounced off a Panther's frontal plate. The tiger whine, though less common, remained a deadly presence. Against these opponents, the Sherman seemed painfully outdated. This was when German mockery peaked. To them, the Sherman looked like a tall, clumsy machine doomed the moment it was spotted. Stories circulated of Panthers taking out multiple Shermans in single engagements. German propaganda celebrated these successes, reinforcing the myth of invulnerable Panzers. But unseen behind the battlefield statistics was a deeper shift, one that would soon redefine the conflict. One of them looked at Jimmy and said, "They can kill the tank, but they can't kill us all." Jimmy never forgot that line. It wasn't bravado. It was the quiet, almost grim understanding that the war was turning in their favor. Not because their tank was better, but because the Allies had finally seized control of the battlefield's tempo. Another powerful example came from Operation Cobra, when carpet bombing shattered German lines and allowed Sherman units to punch through. Lieutenant Frank O'Donnell described driving through smoke-shrouded fields where German positions had been obliterated. It wasn't a tank battle, he recalled. It was movement. We moved, and they couldn't stop us. Even the Panthers that survived the bombardment found themselves isolated, hunted down by combined Sherman platoons working with infantry and air support. As the Allies advanced toward Belgium, the human stories grew even more varied. Some crews felt invincible, riding in columns that stretched for miles. Others felt only increasing dread as they faced towns rigged with ambushes or forests where tigers lay in wait. But through it all, the numbers grew. More Shermans, more parts, more fuel. By the time of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the human experience of Sherman crews had transformed again. In the frozen Ardennes, visibility dropped, engines groaned in the cold, and German armor launched a ferocious counterattack. But unlike earlier in the war, American crews didn't feel outnumbered. They felt pressured, shocked, but not overwhelmed. Reinforcements arrived constantly, bringing fresh tanks and fresh men. One story from this battle illustrates the emotional turning point perfectly. A Sherman commander named Roy Hastings recalled hearing the distant rumble of engines during a tense standoff with a Tiger. At first, he feared more German armor. Then he saw them, dozens of Shermans cresting the hill behind him. He described the scene as a wall of steel rolling forward like a storm front. The Tiger fired one last shot before withdrawing. Within minutes, the Shermans had taken the ridge. For German crews in the Bulge, the experience was devastating. Many Panthers and Tigers were abandoned simply because they ran out of fuel. Tankers who had once mocked the Sherman now found themselves stranded, while the American columns surged past them. Among the most haunting German accounts was from a Panther driver who wrote, "Our machine was magnificent, but magnificence is useless when it cannot move." He never saw another Panther operational after that winter. The final human stories came as the Allies crossed into Germany itself. Town after town fell, with Shermans leading the way. In places like Cologne, Sherman crews engaged enemy armor while advancing through rubble-filled streets. One famous duel between a Sherman and a Panther in Cologne was captured on film, showing the Sherman using maneuverability and teamwork to flank and destroy the Panther. The footage became iconic, not because the Sherman outgunned its opponent, but because it demonstrated the combined arms coordination that defined the late war Allied approach. By spring 1945, the human narrative of the Sherman was clear. German tankers were exhausted, often fighting without hope. Allied crews were tired too, but they were supported, supplied, and constantly reinforced. In interview after interview, veterans on both sides described the same realization. The Sherman was never the best tank, but it was always there. And in war, presence can matter more than perfection. The psychological battlefield of the armored war in Western Europe was every bit as important as the physical one. Inside a tank, fear, confidence, exhaustion, and hope all lived together in the cramped metal space. And as the Sherman clashed again and again with German Panzers, something fundamental changed in the minds of the men who fought the war from behind armor plating. For German tankers, the early war had forged a sense of superiority that was hard to shake. They had grown up hearing that German engineering was the best in the world, that their tanks were masterpieces of design, and that the Soviet and Western machines were crude imitations. In North Africa and the Eastern Front, this belief had often felt true. Tigers and Panthers, when maintained and supplied properly, could destroy enemy tanks at distances where return fire was useless. But Normandy shattered much of that psychological foundation. German crews quickly realized they were fighting not just tanks, but an industrial juggernaut. The first sign of this came not in battle, but in the quiet moments between engagements. A Panther crew might spend an entire night struggling to fix a seized engine or replace a broken track shoe, if they even had the spare parts. Meanwhile, they watched American maintenance vehicles working in shifts, repairing an entire company of Shermans in less time than it took to get a single Panther operational again. A German gunner named Otto Weschler later said, "We would destroy a Sherman and feel proud, but then more appeared, always more. It was like trying to empty the sea with a bucket." This realization was psychologically devastating. The myth of the undefeatable Panzer was crumbling. Tankers who once sneered at the tall, boxy Sherman began to dread the endless columns of them. Their fear wasn't of any single enemy tank, it was of replacement. The knowledge that even if they won today's fight, tomorrow's fight was waiting, and the enemy would arrive in greater numbers than before. On the Allied side, the psychological experience was almost the mirror opposite. Sherman crews lived with the constant fear of being outgunned. They knew a Tiger or Panther could kill them with a single well-placed shot. Many American tankers described the chilling impact of hearing a German shell clang off the hull or seeing the flash of a Panther gun in the distance. They often felt vulnerable, under-equipped, sometimes even expendable. But as the campaigns progressed, a quiet confidence began to take root, not in the Sherman itself, but in the system behind it. Tank Commander Paul Eastman told his men before a major push, "If this tank dies, we get another. If that one dies, they'll send a new crew. We're not stopping, not today, not tomorrow." It wasn't bravado. It was the lived experience of fighting in an army that could sustain its forces indefinitely. Another psychological strength for the Sherman crews came from their integration into combined arms doctrine. They knew they weren't alone. They had artillery on call, they had fighter bombers overhead, they had infantry clearing out anti-tank teams ahead of them. All of this built a sense of partnership, of being part of a massive coordinated machine. German tankers increasingly felt the opposite. Cut off, undersupplied, and bombarded from above, many felt abandoned. Some crews even described firing not out of confidence but desperation. In late 1944, a Panther loader wrote in his diary, "We are lions, but lions in a cage that gets smaller each day." Perhaps the most profound psychological impact for the Germans came when they realized that their technological superiority no longer brought emotional security. Killing a Sherman no longer felt like victory. It felt like delay. They weren't defeating the enemy. They were postponing the inevitable. For American crews, the emotional transformation went in the other direction. Surviving repeated battles, seeing replacements arrive, watching enemy positions collapse under weight of fire and movement. All of this built a mental resilience. They were not fearless. They were not invincible. But they understood that they belonged to a side with momentum, resources, and time on its side. In the end, the psychological war was won not by thicker armor or higher muzzle velocity, but by endurance. The Germans fought brilliantly, often desperately, but with shrinking support and rising doubt. The American crews fought with fear in their hearts, but with the unshakable knowledge that the great machine behind them was still moving forward, and that knowledge changed everything. Looking back at the Second World War, it becomes clear that the Sherman's greatest strength wasn't any single characteristic. It wasn't the gun, the armor, or the engine. It was the way it fit into a vast, coordinated, almost unstoppable system of production, logistics, doctrine, and strategy. The Sherman did not win the armored war by outperforming German tanks. It won by enabling an entirely different style of warfare, one that Germany was never prepared to counter. The first major strategic element was industrial capacity. While Germany produced tanks through specialized workshops, complex designs, and highly skilled labor, the United States approached tank production like it did automobiles. Factories that once built tractors, locomotives, refrigerators, and cars were repurposed to produce armored hulls, turrets, engines, transmissions, and guns. This sprawling industrial engine created not just more tanks, but more parts, more tools, and more support vehicles. War for the United States became an exercise in logistics, not scarcity. German strategists recognized this shift too late. Even their best tanks, Tigers and Panthers, were victims of their own sophistication. A Tiger's gearbox could take weeks to repair. A Panther's engine was notoriously finicky, especially in muddy or dusty conditions. The more elaborate their designs became, the more fragile their armored forces grew. The Sherman, by contrast, embraced the concept of good enough. Its gun could handle most battlefield threats early in the war. Its armor was sufficient for infantry support and medium-range engagements, and, most importantly, its design allowed for mass production and easy repair. In strategic terms, this meant that Allied commanders could plan offensives with the confidence that their armored spearheads could be replenished faster than they were lost. Another strategic strength of the Sherman was standardization. Even though the tank had multiple variants, the core components remained consistent enough for frontline mechanics to work quickly. Spare parts depots rarely ran dry. Recovery vehicles could tow disabled Shermans back for repair. Crews could be reassigned to new tanks with minimal retraining. The entire system was designed around reliability and repeatability. German panzer divisions could never achieve this level of cohesion. A company of Panthers might share components, but their engines and transmissions were notoriously prone to breakdown. Tiger battalions operated almost independently due to their enormous fuel consumption and maintenance needs. Each breakthrough Germany achieved with its heavy tanks came at the cost of enormous logistical strain. Each destroyed Tiger represented not just a battlefield loss, but a strategic wound, a piece of rare machinery that could not easily be replaced. The Sherman's strategic significance was magnified by Allied doctrine. American and British forces rarely expected their tanks to fight alone. Infantry, artillery, engineers, and close air support worked in concert, forming a combined arms system that compensated for the Sherman's weaknesses. If a Panther threatened a column of Shermans, artillery could be called in. If a Tiger blocked a road, fighter bombers could be summoned to strafe or bomb its position. The Sherman became a mobile component in a much larger strategic machine. German doctrine had once emphasized coordination as well, but by 1944, their combined arms capabilities were crumbling. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft. Infantry divisions depleted by years of fighting could not consistently support armored operations. Artillery was increasingly limited by ammunition scarcity. The Panzer Force, once the centerpiece of German battlefield dominance, was reduced to fighting isolated actions without the supporting framework that had made it so formidable in 1940 and 1941. One of the most overlooked strategic strengths of the Sherman was its versatility. It wasn't just a tank, it was a chassis. The same basic frame became a command vehicle, a tank destroyer, an artillery platform, a recovery vehicle, a flamethrower tank, and even a mine-clearing device. Each conversion multiplied the tank's strategic value. Germany had nothing comparable in scale or flexibility. Their heavy tanks were too specialized to adapt, and their lighter tanks lacked battlefield relevance by 1944. The Sherman's strategic impact also extended beyond the front lines. Because it could be produced so efficiently, American commanders could maintain reserves that dwarfed anything Germany could assemble. When a division suffered heavy losses, fresh tanks and crews arrived rapidly, often restoring combat effectiveness within days. This allowed the Allies to maintain pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously, a feat Germany could not match. This consistency created a sense of inevitability. German commanders increasingly realized that destroying a few Shermans here or there meant little. Even destroying dozens might mean little. Somewhere behind the lines were hundreds more waiting to be shipped forward. The psychological weight of this reality shaped German strategic decisions. Panther battalions avoided engagements unless conditions were ideal. Tiger companies were held back, used sparingly, or committed only under strict circumstances. Germany, once the master of armored maneuver, became cautious, too cautious for a war that demanded boldness. For the Allies, the Sherman's strategic reliability enabled operations like the breakout from Normandy, the rapid liberation of France, and the crushing advance into Germany in 1945. The The tank didn't need to be superior, it needed to be present, operational, and supported. This made it the beating heart of Allied mobility, allowing offensives to stretch across hundreds of miles while maintaining momentum. In the end, the strategic significance of the Sherman can be summarized in one idea. It made modern industrial warfare possible. It turned factories into firepower. It turned logistics into victory. It allowed the Allies to wage a war of attrition not as a desperate measure, but as a deliberate strategy. The Germans built better tanks. The Allies built a better system, and the Sherman was the cornerstone of that system. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the Shermans stood everywhere, on ruined city streets, along river crossings, in captured German towns, and scattered across former battlefields. Hundreds sat burned out or abandoned, but thousands more remained operational, engines still humming, crews still alert. Their presence symbolized the ultimate truth of the conflict. The Sherman had endured. It had outlasted its enemies, outpaced its critics, and outperformed expectations not through superiority, but through persistence. In the immediate aftermath, German tankers who had survived captivity spoke openly about their experiences. Many still felt pride in their Panthers and Tigers, but almost all acknowledged the impossible challenge they had faced. One former Panther commander remarked, "We had the sharper sword, but they had the stronger arm." It was a simple expression that captured the essence of the war's industrial reality. He and his crew had fought skillfully, sometimes even brilliantly, but they were trapped in a machine they could not sustain. Allied tankers, on the other hand, carried mixed emotions. Veterans spoke of the Sherman with a combination of affection and frustration. It had saved their lives as often as it had nearly cost them. Many remembered its mechanical reliability with gratitude. "It always started in the morning," one driver said, but they also carried memories of friends lost in fires or explosions when German guns found their mark. The Sherman was never a beloved masterpiece the way some German crews adored their Tigers. It was a dependable workhorse, a partner in survival, a tool that did its job even when the job seemed impossible. Yet the wider legacy of the Sherman stretched far beyond personal memories. Its influence reshaped military thinking for decades. Nations studying the war came to understand that technological brilliance alone could not guarantee victory. Mobility, logistics, standardization, and industrial output were equally decisive. The Sherman became a case study in how a balanced, reliable, mass-producible system could overpower specialized elite machines through attrition and coordination. The tank's post-war career reinforced this lesson. Shermans continued to serve in dozens of countries for decades after World War II, from the Middle East to Latin America to Asia. Some were upgraded with new guns, engines, or armor. Others fought in conflicts as late as the 1970s. Their longevity was a direct testament to their simplicity and adaptability. Armies without sophisticated industrial bases favored them precisely because they were so easy to maintain. Meanwhile, the German tanks that had terrified Allied crews in 1944 faded quickly from practical use. Panthers and Tigers were too complex, too fragile, and too demanding for post-war militaries. They required expert mechanics, rare parts, and ideal conditions, luxuries nations recovering from war simply didn't have. In museum halls, these tanks remain imposing icons, their thick armor and massive guns still inspiring awe. But that awe is historical, not operational. The battlefield favored the machine that could keep fighting, and the Sherman proved it could. Perhaps the most profound legacy of the Sherman lies in the way it reshaped perceptions of warfare. For generations, tank discussions revolved around armor thickness, gun penetration, and top speed. After the war, strategists learned to ask new questions. How quickly can we replace this tank? How easily can we repair it? How well does it integrate with infantry, artillery, and air support? How adaptable is it to new threats? These were Sherman questions. Less glamorous, but far more consequential. Today, standing in front of a restored Sherman, one can see both its limitations and its genius. It is not sleek, it is not intimidating, but it tells a story about a world-changing insight that victory often goes not to the strongest, but to the most sustainable. The Sherman's legacy is not that it was the best tank of the war, it is that it was the right tank for the war the Allies needed to fight. The war in Europe ended with columns of Shermans rolling across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. What began as a tank mocked by its enemies, underestimated by many of its own crews, and overshadowed by German engineering, had become the machine that carried the Allied armies to victory. There was something poetic about that transformation, not dramatic or glamorous, but steady, inevitable, and quietly powerful. Imagine the final days of the war. A misty German morning, the streets wet with rain, buildings silent except for the rumble of engines echoing through them. Shermans move forward in long lines, their crews tired, covered in grime, but alive. Some tanks are patched with makeshift armor, others still bear scorch marks from battles survived weeks earlier. Each one carries a story, fear, loss, endurance, and the strange mixture of hope and exhaustion that comes at the end of a long, brutal campaign. In those final moments, even German civilians and soldiers could see the reality with their own eyes. The Shermans were everywhere, not invincible, not perfect, but present. A presence so large and so persistent that it had reshaped the outcome of a continent-wide war. For the men who fought in them, the Sherman became a symbol not of superiority, but of solidarity, a machine that did its job day after day across rivers, forests, hedgerows, towns, and open fields, a machine that represented the industrial strength, logistical skill, and collective determination of an entire nation and its allies working together. And so the story ends where it began, with a tank once dismissed as fragile and unimpressive, proving that quantity, reliability, and relentless pressure can triumph over even the most formidable opposition. The tide of steel did not come because it was perfect. It came because it never stopped coming.